Evaluation: the scope of interactionist approach. Let us now see how does interactionist approach stand along other approaches of second language acquisition. So this interactionist approach, which relates to input hypothesis, output hypothesis, and interactionist hypothesis, has triggered a lot of research strands. And we can possibly divide these research strands into two main phases. The first phase of research, which was triggered by this approach, was that it started to document and the negotiation of meaning between the native and non-native speakers. So there was a lot of studies that related to description of what went on during the negotiation between native speakers and non-native speakers, and whether this intake was taken up by the learners or it was not taken up by the learners. In any case, these were descriptive studies. The second phase actually developed in different forms. Now, the first was an exploration of environmental factors, or looking at how the environmental language learning related to our concepts of universal grammar. And if you would like to remind yourself, remember, universal grammar has always argumented that within human beings there has to be some sort of language processing device and some sort of structure that allows the learners to actually learn a language, although the input of that language that comes to them is fairly fragmentary. Yet the children are able to go beyond that fragmentary language input and develop a whole language system. Then there was a lot of interest in negative evidence. If you would remember that by negative evidence, we meant the feedback that is given to the learners in relation to their understanding that whatever form of language they are using, that is so slightly incorrect. So we talked about recasts, that is indirect form of feedback, and other form of feedback which is more direct. So the questions that were explored was, what impact does this negative evidence have on the learner's uptake or intake of language? And then, of course, there was a lot of research which also focused on information processing. So how does the input of language, that is, the language that the learners receive from more proficient learners or within their environment, how is it changed into intake? That is, how do they actually grasp the structures of the language by hearing or processing the language that comes to them? So this focus of information processing formed the third strand of research in the second phase of research. However, there still lacked, and we still don't have an appropriate property theory which remains unclarified by the interactionist approach. So we do not have a clear answer to the question of what is language comprised of. And then interactionists are mainly fixated on certain aspects and they don't go beyond that. So they are fixated, for instance, on the role of selective attention. So which aspects of the language that comes to them do the learners pay attention to? Remember, we said when you give a lecture or when the learners hear a language, They themselves select certain aspects of the language to pay attention to. So that means input of the language is not the same as the intake of the language. So this selective attention, which parts of the language were paid attention to, what impact did it have on the learning of the second language, and this concept of saliency, how do you highlight certain aspects of the language? So if the learners are paying attention to only some parts of an utterance or a sentence, then how can we possibly heighten the saliency or increase the importance of those aspects that the teacher or wants the learners to pay attention to? So this is what we mean by saliency. And then they also wanted to know what are the constraints that the learners face when they are processing a language. So what are the processing constraints that change the input of the language into intake? Nevertheless, attempts to build a comprehensive model is rare. You do not have a comprehensive model of language, property theory of language, transition theory of language, and how does it all happen. And we still need a more principled approach to theory building from an interaction perspective. So this is where we are with the interactionist approach.